Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Follower Podcast and this fourth episode in our Advent series called The Coming, where hopefully week by week we've been stirring ourselves to a deep affection for the person of Jesus so that this week, as we arrive at Christmas, we arrive there with wonder, not more consumed with unwrapping our presents than we are with beholding the miracle of Jesus, who is behind all of this celebration in the first place. This episode is entitled, Yes, That's the God We Don't Believe in. Reflections on love in an age of fear. Now, to kick this off, I have conversations with people about faith all the time. It's kind of what I do. Right. And I meet people all over the place, whether it's in restaurants or in the gym or in shopping malls. I make it a habit to greet people. I would encourage you that just saying hello is a wonderful open door into connection with other human beings. And sometimes those greetings go places. We end up talking about life and our fears and our common journeys. And in my line of work, the things that I do, I've also been incredibly blessed to be able to travel to so many different parts of the world. And I've had conversations with people over cups of tea and coffee and all kinds of different drinks and meals. And we've spoken about the common human experience. And when you listen long enough to anybody's story, eventually the question of God comes up. Why? Because we are spiritual beings. And spirituality is baked into our experience on this planet. And so you listen long enough, you'll get past, this is what I do for work, this is my family, this is where I come from. And eventually you're going to get into the conversation of spirituality. And many people I speak to, we can have such a robust conversation, so much connection, right? We're talking about common universal things, our own longings and hopes. They're telling me about their desires for their family and their kids and their own lives. They're telling me about their pain and their joy. We're sharing tears and laughter. There's connection. And then in that place of spirituality, this word God kind of rises up and throws a shadow over the authenticity of that connection. And so often people shut down in the wake of this word. And the reason is not the word itself. The reason is because the word is like a container for a bunch of ideas. And depending on the ideas that are in that container is going to determine how you do or don't respond to the word. And so, from a faith perspective, as a follower of Jesus, when I say I believe in God, that's a life-giving thing to me. When I say I follow God, I have a relationship with God, man, these are beautiful things because I know the kind of God I'm talking about as revealed to me through the person of Jesus. But that's not everybody's experience. For some people, that word God is filled with so much trauma and so much pain and so many difficult experiences that when you say it, it triggers a kind of reaction in them that is defensive, dismissive, that shuts down before conversation can happen. You see, the word God is powerful. It's a tool that can be used to manipulate, control, and even sanctify personal agendas and opinions. And you can kind of put them out of reach of the criticism of people by using that word God said, or this is of God. And just think how this plays itself out in political spaces. Very recently, we'd seen some elections, and there are such religious undertones that are kind of backing a certain kind of party. And without getting too deep into the political weeds, I think it's always problematic when we get into this idea that God is somehow on our side. There's the beautiful story of Israel. They've crossed the Jordan. They're now going to the city of Jericho. They meet the angel of the Lord. Some people think this is a Christophany. In other words, Jesus showing up in the story before he's born as a baby. Long, complicated thing. We don't have to get into it. But they are speaking with this angel of the Lord's armies, and they ask him this question. They say, are you on our side or are you on their side? And the angel says, no, I'm on God's side. I'm on God's side. What do we learn from that? That God can't be easily co-opted or manipulated and shouldn't be to kind of further our own agendas, whether it's political, economic, social, or otherwise. Sadly, we don't always heed that warning, and we abuse this word God, and we abuse the power of the word in order to push a whole bunch of our agendas forward. I can think in South Africa alone, the history of apartheid and how apartheid and the segregation of people by race and the abuse of people according to the color of their skin was sanctioned because of a theological paradigm, right? That this is the will of God. You see that in the United States of America with the civil rights movement, and how there was this kind of very warped theology that slaves should just submit to their masters, and that somehow people of color were subhuman, all in the name of God. You think about wars that have been fought in the name of God. And this is not only Christian problems. Pretty much anywhere there's some kind of system that's trying to understand or relate to God, there is also the abuse of that system. And some people have been victims of these abuses to such an extent that their view of God is so warped and so broken that the only reasonable response that they could have to that view of God would be to reject it. Sometimes when I speak to people and the conversation of God comes up and they say, no, I don't believe in God. One of the things I want to ask them is, well, tell me about the God you don't believe in. And when they start to tell me about the God they don't believe in, I just kind of nod my head and I say, man, your atheism is the only sane response to that kind of God. And I want to look at them in the eyes and say, yes, yes, that's the God we don't believe in. But is there perhaps somewhere mixed in with all our failed attempts to try and represent God and understand God and connect with God, is there a God that's worth believing in? Is there a God we could believe in? Is there a God that if we believed in that God, and not just believed in that God, but leveraged our trust in the direction of that God, built our lives around the ways of that God, is there a God who could actually give us life? Is there a God who could speak to our deepest longings? Is there a God who could bring healing both personally and corporately to us? Is there a God that kind of affronts and rejects so many of the abusive systems of our time? Is there a God that looks much more like we hope was possible than what we've seen is often common? Is there a God that's worth believing in? And this is where Christmas, Jesus, is such an incredible miracle, because it definitively affirms that desire and says with a resounding shout, yes, there is. Even if you think about back in the day, like the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament, and that book didn't fall into a vacuum. It fell into a cultural context, and that people of that time understood something about God. And the thing they understood about God, or the idea of God, was that this God was distant, that this God was typically angry, that this God needed to be appeased, or these gods. And so there were many ways of relating to the gods that involved human sacrifice, that involved the abuse of other people, that involved the neglect of the human being, right? The gods were angry, the gods were vengeful. And so into the story comes another kind of God, where even in the very beginning, there is a God who brings order out of chaos. There is a God who speaks light into darkness. There's a God who orders things, brings beauty into things. And even when the human beings that this God has made in its image, even when they fail, they are covering themselves with fig leaves. But this God provides skin, animal skin. And where does that come from? The first sacrifice. This God is a God of grace. This God is the kind of God who wants to walk with people in the cool of the day. This God is a God who desires union and friendship. It's a different kind of God than we see in the abuses of the idea all around us. And that picture culminates really in the person of Jesus. And this is why Christmas is so, so important. Because the scriptures say this beautiful thing. They say, in the face of Christ is the glory of God. And Jesus says of himself, he says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. In other words, what they're saying is, if we just hold that word God and we go, yes, this is a container for a bunch of ideas, man, that's a very abstract, hard to wrap your mind around concept, right? The unknowable, eternal creator of all things, shrouded in mystery. We're kind of fumbling around in the dark, trying to figure out who this creator is and what this creator is like. But then Jesus comes, and Jesus is God with skin on. That's the beauty of the incarnation. That's the beauty of a baby in a manger, and that baby grows up to be Jesus, the Son of Man, who says of himself that he is the way, the truth, and the life. And we read in Genesis chapter 1 that in the beginning was the Word, and then in John chapter 1 that this Word was Jesus, and that the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So God looks like Jesus. If you're wondering, man, I just don't know if I can get behind believing in God because I've seen all the abuses of that God. I would say never judge an idea based on the abuses thereof, because there is a kind of God that's worth believing in, and that's, I would say to you, it's the God we find in Jesus, and that's the miracle of Christmas. Because of all the ways in which God could come to us, this God comes to us as a baby in a manger. This God comes to us in weak vulnerability. This God comes to us through refugee parents, to a family. We know that Jesus didn't come from a rich family. His family was probably some kind of migrant labor situation. His dad, a carpenter / builder in some way. And so this God isn't coming through the systems of the world. This God isn't coming with fanfare. This God isn't coming through power mechanisms. This God isn't coming through rockets and tanks and wars. This God isn't coming through ego, ambition, and strength. This God is entering the world through weakness. Through vulnerability. This God is coming and identifying with those who find themselves in the margins. That's why we've seen in the last couple of weeks, he appeared to the woman and to the shepherds and was born in an animal feeding trough in a cave, and he grew up in obscurity. And then his whole life is this life of service, right? Jesus shows us another kind of God. In Philippians 2, we read this beautiful phrase here. I love this. It says that Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking on the very nature of a servant and being made in human likeness. The God we find in Jesus is a servant God. I don't know what you feel when you look around the world today and you look at our leaders and you look at how ego and hubris is kind of dominating the airwaves and the headlines like a thick fog hanging over our lives. There is something that cries out inside of me and says, God, is there just someone who could serve? Isn't there anybody who is more interested in the good of others than their own personal agenda? Is there a servant leader anywhere to be found? And so we're crying, we're longing for something. And Jesus comes and he says, I am that thing. In Jesus, we find the God that we are looking for. And what does this have to do with love? And I would say to you, from the words of 1 John, Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. And whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he has loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. Verse 12, no one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. And so here we get this beautiful picture. And this is why this part of the Advent journey is often called love or adoration. That God is a God of love. That famous verse, if you've been in church for more than 5 seconds. For God so loved the world that he sent his only son. And love, friends, love is not a sentimental. Love is not just chocolates and roses. Love is not just nice dates and warm feelings. Love is really the engine of creation. And so if you're struggling with who God is, I want to say to you that Jesus has shown us who God is. And the God we see in Jesus is love. And anywhere else in the context of our story, as we look around at people who claim to be doing things in the name of God, we need to ask ourselves, well, does what they're doing look like love? And how do we know if it looks like love? Well, fantastically, the Bible's given us a few criteria, right? That person who claims to be doing things in the name of God, are they patient? Are they kind? Do they envy? Are they boastful? Are they proud? Do they dishonor other people? Are they self-seeking? Are they easily angered? Do they keep a record of wrongs? Do they delight in evil, or do they rejoice in truth? Are these the kind of people who are always protecting, trusting, hoping, and never failing, persevering? See, these are the markers of love. This is the love that we find in Jesus, and Jesus tells us who God is. And I'm going to just kind of hit two people right here, right? The one group of people I want to just speak to quickly is those of us who would call ourselves followers of Jesus. Can I say, with all the love and care in the world, I want to say, as gently as I can, that you and I don't own Jesus. That in the best possible way, Jesus is not a Christian. Yeah. And by that, what I mean to say is that Jesus isn't obliged to agree with everything that Christendom says is essential, true, or important. If Jesus walked into any church in the world at any given moment, he would find things in that community that do not represent him well. Am I saying that I am a universalist who believes all roads lead to Rome? No, definitively not. I'm saying that I believe Jesus is the way to the Father, and no one comes to the Father except through him. That Jesus has revealed to us a kind of God that you simply won't find anywhere else. And so if you're looking for a God who is a Father, literally the only access point is Christ himself. What I am also arguing for, though, is that we don't confuse our religious perspectives with the person of Christ. Is there such a thing as absolute truth? Amen, hallelujah. Do I have it? Very unlikely, because truth is a person, and his name is Jesus. And so, for you and I who claim to be followers of Jesus, we have to hold that claim lightly. We have to recognize that our perspectives are definitely tainted. And particularly in an age right now where there's a kind of rise of nationalism, the blurring of those lines are difficult to see. Right? Very, very difficult to see. And we, like Israel, can be those people standing before the angel of the Lord saying, are you on our side? And God very gently, I think, in grace and sometimes sternly and strongly says, no. I'm on God's side. I won't be easily possessed or owned or bought by a political party or a national agenda or a particular preference or a religious ideal. I am far bigger than that. And so in your own faith, again and again and again, this is not a once-off time. As we come to Christmas, it would be a healthy thing to do to hold the Jesus that you believe in, right, up against the light of the Jesus we find in the manger. It would be a really good thing to do that and to let Jesus critique your perspective of him, because I can guarantee you, not because I'm a prophet, just because I'm a human, your perspective is partial at best, because we're always growing into deeper revelation of who this man is and what it means to follow him. And so Christmas is a fantastic time to say, hey, Jesus is the person that I see in my mind and carry in my heart when I say that I love you. Does he look like this boy, this baby born to a refugee family in a shack in the middle of nowhere? Is this the same Jesus who laid down his life for his friends, who was a servant of all, who had nowhere to lay his head, who created margin and space, who reclined at table with zealots and tax collectors? Is it that Jesus? Is this the Jesus who comes in the most obscure, unexpected places, who thinks that the least of these are the greatest? Is this the Jesus whose kingdom is a mustard seed, who when they found that he was powerful, they tried to make him king, and this Jesus resisted those power positions and went away to be with the Father? Is this the same Jesus who thought the way to save the world was through a cross? Is this the same Jesus who, when his disciple picked up a sword, said, no, 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 no. If we live by the sword, we die by the sword? Is it that Jesus who ended the cycle of violence in his own body? A Jesus who, when he was confronted by his disciples to say, man, when you're in your power, can we sit on your left and on your right? And this Jesus said, that is how the tyrants and the rulers of this age wield their power over others, but it will not be so with you. Are we following that Jesus, the Jesus who had a preference for the poor and the forgotten? Or are we in some ways following our own ego projections, our own preferences? And the answer to that is yes. Yes, we are. There's grace for that. But it's good to call it out into the light and ask for God to refine our perspective of him, because whatever we think about when we think about God is the most important thing about us, right? And then the second group of people, if you react violently to the idea of God, if when you hear that name or that word, everything in you shuts down because of what you've seen. And if you were to sit with me and describe what you have against the idea, I would probably agree with so much of what you say, and I would say to you, yes, yes, that's the God we don't believe in. But I would also say, but there is a God worth believing in. And if you would just give him a chance, I believe that he is everything you most deeply long for. And I would encourage you not to judge an idea based on its abuse, but to really, really set aside every broken attempt to try and represent Jesus. And for yourself, go and consider the man. Go and look at his life. Go and look at his teachings. See what he actually claimed to do and to be. And then allow yourself to be awakened to the wonder of him. And perhaps just maybe you could lean in his direction. Is there something in you, if you find it hard to believe in God, that's been crying out for the kind of God that meets you in a manger, right? That sees you on the margins, that comes to you in weakness and vulnerability and love. And so that's the end of our Advent series, friends. If you found this conversation helpful, you can go find a reflective article and some exercises by going to www.wearefollower.com and subscribing. You'll find it in your inbox shortly. I hope that as we've explored the ideas of hope and peace and joy and love and the God of love that we find in Jesus, I hope that what this has done is kind of prepared your heart to arrive at Christmas with wonder. And so as we go into this week, and as we come to that day and that great celebration, wherever you find yourself, with family around a table, in a church, as would be a great idea, in the place of worship with an open Bible, hopefully with a full tummy, and if not, to know that you, like many, like Mary and like Joseph, are there with Jesus, who is the friend of those who grieve and mourn and weep. If Christmas is a hard time for you, if it's a time of grief, suffering, loss, regret, loneliness, know that this is a celebration not of the kind of God who gets the invitation to the popular red carpet events, but the kind of God who was not welcomed into the inn because there was no room for him there, and was born into a manger to refugee parents as a person on the margins, lived a servant's life, died a horrible death, but was resurrected in the power of God to initiate a new kind of reality that we call his kingdom. And that you, regardless of where you are or what you're experiencing right now, you can enter into that kingdom through friendship with this Jesus. He is love. He loves you. And his desire is for you to enter into that love through his sacrifice. I hope that this Christmas is wonderful for you, and we'll see you again next year for a new series in the Follower podcast, which is going to be very exciting. Until then, be blessed, and we'll chat to you soon.